There's a particular kind of evil that hides inside a uniform of grief. It wears black. It speaks softly. It stands at the edge of every fresh hole in the ground with a shovel and a look of practiced solemnity on its face, and no one thinks to question it, because no one questions the gravedigger. No one stands at the rim of a newly dug grave and wonders about the man who prepared it. The dead are beyond harm, we tell ourselves. Whatever comes after the coffin lid closes is just the quiet work of the earth, and the man with the spade is just the instrument of that quiet. It is one of the few assumptions we hold with complete confidence, that the grave is the end of the story, not the beginning of a different one. In Pike County, Kentucky, in the winter of 1871, that assumption was weaponized against an entire community for at least 7 years. Silas Crowe was 53 years old when what he had been doing, quietly, systematically, in plain sight across 3 churchyard communities along the Levisa Fork of the Big Sandy River, was finally discovered. He had dug graves for somewhere between 60 and 90 individuals, by the estimate given to the Pike County Circuit Court in the spring of 1871. The actual number was never established with certainty. The investigation that followed his arrest was conducted by men who were not sure, even as they drove their shovels into the frozen churchyard soil, that they wanted to know the full answer. Some of what they found in those graves was what they expected to find. Some of it was not. And one grave in the churchyard of Pond Fork Baptist contained something that ended the assumptions of everyone present and replaced them with a question that the community spent the next 150 years trying not to ask out loud. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you are watching from and tell me what time it is there. Before this story is finished, you will be glad of the distance. Pike County in 1871 was a county that had come through the Civil War badly and was still working out what it was on the other side of it. The war had split families down the middle. It had left resentments that ran along bloodlines and property lines and old debts, and those resentments made ordinary community oversight collapse in ways that weren't dramatic enough to be noticed, just a slow withdrawal of the habit of watching, of asking, of accounting for one another. The churches along the Levisa Fork were doing the essential work of holding the community together, but their records from this period are fragmentary. Their ministers were often itinerant, riding circuits through hollows and across ridge roads that could be impassable for weeks at a stretch. Their congregations were spread thin across terrain that resisted the kind of density that makes communities naturally watchful. 3 or 4 miles between neighbors, weeks between pastoral visits, the fog coming in early in October and not lifting properly until March. It was exactly the kind of landscape and exactly the kind of historical moment in which an unremarkable man with a useful skill could operate without close supervision for a very long time. Silas Crowe was not a man who attracted attention. He was lean and long-limbed, with a kind of angular thinness that comes from hard physical work in the cold through decades of mountain winters. His hands were large for his body, wide-palmed, blunt-fingered, permanently stained the dark reddish-brown color of Appalachian clay that no amount of washing fully removes. His eyes were set deep under a heavy brow and were described in the testimony of multiple witnesses as brown and flat, eyes that looked at you without revealing anything in return. He was a widower. He attended church irregularly but without causing comment. He charged a fair rate for his work, he arrived on time, and he dug a clean, square hole. He was, in the words of Reverend Thomas Halcomb of Pond Fork Baptist, words recorded in Halcomb's personal diary, which was entered into the court record in March 1871, a man you trusted because there was no particular reason not to. That was his entire method. He had built his invisibility one unremarkable day at a time until the unremarkable days had accumulated into years, and the years had become a framework inside which something else was happening entirely. The economic structure of his work made the invisibility even more complete. A gravedigger in a rural Appalachian community in the 1860s and 1870s was paid a flat fee per grave, typically between 50 cents and $1, depending on the size of the plot and the difficulty of the ground. It was not lucrative work. It was sufficient, combined with the small garden plot Crowe maintained at his ridge property and the occasional timber work he took on in the warmer months to keep a single man in modest but stable circumstances. No one looked too closely at the finances of a man who was not spending extravagantly, who was not acquiring property or goods beyond what his visible income could explain, who seemed, in every external marker, to be living exactly the kind of life that a widowed gravedigger on the Leviza Fork would be expected to live. What the investigation of 1871 eventually suggested, what Dr. Fitch's private letters described with the careful obliqueness of a man who understood the implications of what he was writing, was that Crowe's actual income had a second stream. The body trade that operated throughout the eastern United States in the mid-19th century functioned on a straightforward economic logic. Medical schools and anatomical teaching institutions required cadavers for instruction and dissection. The legal supply of those cadavers through executed criminals and donated bodies was entirely insufficient to meet demand, and men with access to fresh graves occupied a uniquely valuable position in the resulting informal market. A body delivered in good condition to a receiving agent in Cincinnati or Lexington might bring $5 to $10, 5 to 10 times what Crowe earned for digging the grave. Over the course of a year, over the course of 7 years, the arithmetic of that arrangement compounded quietly into something substantial. Not substantial enough to change the external appearance of his life, which was the point, but substantial enough to have motivated what the investigation found. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a grave, but from a weight. In December of 1870, a family named Compton buried their youngest son at Pond Fork Baptist Churchyard. The boy was 7 years old. His name was Eli. The death was attributed to fever, which was common enough in those mountain winters that no one questioned the cause. Reverend Halcomb conducted the service. Silas Crowe dug the grave and handled the coffin, as he had done for this community for years. The family was present for the burial, as families were. The coffin was lowered. The grave was filled. The family went home. 3 weeks later, the boy's older brother, 12-year-old Daniel Compton, told his mother something she did not initially know what to do with. He said that when Silas Crowe lifted the coffin to set it on the ropes for lowering, it had moved. Not a settling of weight or a shift during transit, a movement from inside the box. His mother told him he was mistaken. Children see things at funerals. They are frightened, and grief works on the mind in ways that are not rational. She told him to pray and to put it from his thoughts. He could not put it from his thoughts. He told his father, James Compton, who told him the same thing. But the father found himself unable to fully dismiss it, and after 2 weeks of unsuccessful effort, he brought it, reluctantly and with visible discomfort, to Reverend Halcomb. Halcomb recorded the conversation in his personal diary. He wrote, "The Compton boy is not a fanciful child. He's plain-spoken and steady. I do not know what to make of what he told his father. I am aware that what it implies, if true, is something I am not prepared to consider." He considered it anyway. He brought it to the county sheriff. Sheriff Willard Peck was skeptical and said so plainly, but he agreed to make an inquiry. He visited Silas Crowe at his home on the ridge above the Leviza Fork in January 1871. The visit was informal. Crowe answered every question calmly, without apparent unease. The coffin had been properly sealed. He had handled it as he always did. The boy had been in a state of grief and must have seen something that wasn't there. Peck agreed that this was the most reasonable explanation, noted the visit in his log, and closed the inquiry. And then James Compton went to the churchyard himself and dug up his son's grave. He did this on a February morning in 1871 when the ground was still partly frozen and the work was brutal and took most of the day. He did it without telling anyone in advance. He did it because he had not slept a full night since his boy went into the ground, and because the thing his remaining son had said had gotten into him in a way he could not extract by reason or by prayer. He dug until his hands bled in the cold and the light was going, and he got the coffin open. It did not contain his son. The coffin contained stones and packed earth, arranged to approximate the mass of a child's body. There was no sign of Eli Compton anywhere in the box. James Compton walked directly from the churchyard to the sheriff's office in Pikeville without stopping. He arrived covered in clay, his hands wrapped in strips torn from his shirt. He placed both hands on Sheriff Peck's desk and said, in the language recorded by Peck's deputy in the office log that afternoon, "Open every grave that man touched, every one of them. Do it now." Peck opened 4 graves over the following 3 days, working with 2 deputies and a hired laborer from outside the community. The results were not consistent, which made them, in some ways, more disturbing than if they had been uniform. 2 graves contained what they were supposed to contain. One, like the Compton boy's coffin, was packed with material and held nothing human. The 4th, a grave in the Elkhorn Creek churchyard belonging to a man named Samuel Vance, dead the previous spring of what the community understood to be a stroke, contained remains. But the remains were not in the condition that a body 8 months in the ground in that soil and climate should have been. And the way Samuel Vance's remains were arranged in the coffin was not the way a dead man is prepared and laid out for burial. Peck sent for Silas Crowe that same afternoon. Crowe was not at his home. He had not been there since morning, according to a neighbor. His tools were gone. His mule was gone. He had known, through some means that was never established, that the graves were being opened. He was found 4 days later at a rooming house in Lawrence County across the Tug Fork in West Virginia. He offered no resistance to arrest. He was transported back to Pikeville and held in the county jail for examination. He refused to say a single word, not in response to questions from the sheriff, from the circuit court judge, or from Reverend Halcomb, who visited him in the jail with the specific intention of appealing to whatever portion of his conscience had survived intact. Crowe sat in his cell and looked at every man who came to question him with those flat brown eyes, and he gave them nothing. His silence was not the silence of a man who hadn't decided what to say. It was the silence of a man who had decided very clearly that nothing anyone in that county could offer him was worth the cost of speaking. Halcomb wrote in his diary after his jail visit, "He did not appear distressed. He did not appear repentant. He appeared to be waiting. For what, I cannot determine, but the quality of his patience was not that of a man resigned to his fate. It was the patience of a man who believed his situation was not yet fully determined." Whether that belief reflected something specific, knowledge, connections, leverage, or simply the confident stillness of a man accustomed to operating without oversight, no one was ever able to establish. The investigation that followed was conducted with the particular grim thoroughness of men who had begun to understand they had been wrong about the scale of what they were dealing with. Sheriff Peck brought in 2 deputies from Pikeville and hired a 3rd man from outside the county, a former sheriff from Lawrence County, Virginia, who had dealt with a similar situation there in the early 1860s, and whose experience Peck valued more than he valued his own comfort in what was beginning to look like a situation with no comfortable resolution. They opened the graves methodically, in daylight, with the minimum number of people present that the work allowed, on the understanding that what they found should be processed carefully before the community at large was informed of it. The investigation that followed was conducted with the particular grim thoroughness of men who had begun to understand they had been wrong about the scale of what they were dealing with. Over the following 6 weeks, they opened 18 graves across the 3 communities. Of those 18, 7 contained the remains they were supposed to contain in the condition consistent with the time they had been in the ground. 3 were packed with material and contained no human remains at all. 8 contained remains, but the circumstances of those remains, the positioning, the condition, the physical evidence preserved in the earth around the coffin, did not match the official story of a peaceful death and a proper burial. Dr. Aldous Fitch, the physician called in from Pikeville to assist the examination, filed an official report with the Circuit Court in March 1871. His official report was careful, measured, and deliberately limited in what it committed to formal record. But his private correspondence, a set of letters to his brother in Lexington that surfaced in a Frankfurt estate sale in 1994, and were subsequently donated to the University of Kentucky Special Collections, described what he had actually concluded after 6 weeks of examining those graves. He wrote to his brother, "What this man was doing I cannot state in full in any document that will be read by the families involved. I will say only that the absence in some cases and the condition in others suggests a traffic in the recently deceased, and in some cases, the not quite deceased, that was systematic, deliberate, and of considerable duration. I believe the county has been opening graves for 6 weeks and has not yet found the full answer. I am not certain the full answer exists anywhere that can now be reached. The phrase, "not quite deceased," is the one that stops the breath. What it described, the sale of bodies, and potentially of people not yet fully dead, to anatomical suppliers and medical schools operating in Ohio and across Kentucky, was a practice that existed throughout the 19th century at the margins of the legal economy, driven by a medical establishment with more demand for cadavers than the law provided means to supply. Gravediggers with access to fresh burial grounds were the logical link in that chain. The buyer or buyers connected to Silas Crowe were never identified or charged. No network was ever mapped. The financial records that would have documented the transactions, if they existed, were never found. The official investigation looked at the graves and at Crowe and concluded its work there without following the chain any further. Crowe was convicted in Pike County Circuit Court in March 1871 on multiple counts of unlawful disinterment. The families of the affected community were not told the full extent of what the investigation had found. The judge's sentencing remarks described the offense as a crime against the sanctity of the dead and the peace of the bereaved. He sentenced Crowe to 9 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary at Frankfort. The sentence was served in full. Silas Crowe was released in 1880. He was 62 years old. There is no record of where he went, what he did, or whether any community in the years that followed ever trusted him with a shovel and a churchyard. The graves along the Levisa Fork were examined one final time in the summer of 1871, after the trial was complete. The county hired men from outside the community to conduct the work, on the understanding that local men could not be asked to dig in those churchyards with the full knowledge of what they might find. The final count of graves that contained something other than what they were supposed to contain was recorded and delivered privately by Sheriff Peck to the circuit court judge, and from the judge to the ministers of the 3 churches. None of them ever disclosed the number publicly. In the final entry of the diary he kept through this period, Reverend Halcombe wrote, "We have decided together that the families have suffered enough. The number will not help them. It will only add to the weight they already carry. God knows it. That will have to be sufficient." Today, the churchyards along the Levisa Fork in Pike County are still in use. Pond Fork Baptist has been rebuilt twice since 1871. The current congregation has no particular memory of what happened in the winter and spring of that year. The graves from the 1860s and early 1870s still stand in the oldest section, their markers worn nearly smooth by 150 years of mountain weather. Some of them contain what they are supposed to contain. Some of them do not. No one has gone back to determine which is which. The community made a decision in 1871 that the living needed to be able to bury their dead without the full knowledge of what had been done to the dead before them, and that decision has held quietly and without discussion ever since. Here is the question that Silas Crowe leaves behind, and it is not a comfortable one. He operated in plain sight, in the most visible role a community possesses, the handling of its dead, the sealing of its grief, the final physical act that transitions a person from the living world to the ground beneath it. He did it for years without generating meaningful suspicion, not because the community was careless, but because the role itself generated immunity. The gravedigger is trusted not because anyone knows him well, but because the alternative, the suspicion that he might not be trustworthy, is something the mind refuses to fully entertain in the presence of fresh grief. It is too dark a thought to hold at a funeral, so the community extended trust not to the man but to the uniform he wore, and the man understood that perfectly and used it accordingly. Was Silas Crowe uniquely monstrous? Or does he expose something about the way communities assign trust to roles rather than to people, the way we extend a kind of immunity to certain functions because examining them closely is too costly, too disturbing, too disruptive to the rituals we depend on? Because if it is the second thing, then Silas Crowe is not a relic of 1871. He is a warning about every institution we have decided is too sacred to examine carefully. Drop your answer in the comments below. Monster or mirror of something far older and wider than one man with a shovel? If these sealed histories are the reason you are here, and you want to go further into the records that were closed before anyone could ask the right questions, subscribe and ring the bell. What comes next will not be easier than this one. The mountains remember, even when the churchyards have forgotten. And the clay of the Leviza Fork is very dark. It is very patient. It keeps what was put into it, and it has been keeping it for 150 years.